Welcome back to History Teller YT, the channel where the past comes alive and every story shapes the way we see the world today. Today, we're diving into one of the deadliest civil wars in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. From 1850 to 1864, China was engulfed in a conflict so massive, so devastating, that it claimed tens of millions of lives and changed the course of a nation forever. Imagine a young man claiming to be the younger brother of Jesus, leading a movement that challenged the centuries-old Qing dynasty, while attempting to build a society based on equality, morality, and radical reform. Cities burned, entire villages vanished, and the rivers of China ran red with the blood of countless soldiers and civilians. This is not just a story of war. It's a story of vision, zeal, betrayal, famine, revolution, and the resilience of the human spirit. So, stay with us as we unravel 20 parts of history, piece by piece, from the rise of the heavenly kingdom to the shocking aftermath that reshaped China. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just the events, but the incredible lessons this rebellion holds for humanity. Let's begin the journey into the chaos, ambition, and legacy of the Taiping Rebellion. In the early 19th century, the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, was showing signs of deep vulnerability. Centuries of centralized imperial rule had led to a rigid bureaucracy, and corruption had seeped into the highest levels of governance. The once powerful dynasty now struggled to maintain control over a vast and increasingly restless population. Economic hardship was widespread. Natural disasters such as floods and famines frequently struck, leaving millions of peasants destitute. The introduction of opium by Western powers had further destabilized the economy, creating widespread addiction that eroded social cohesion and drained the treasury. The population, particularly in southern provinces such as Guangxi and Guangdong, felt the weight of these failures keenly. Many were trapped in cycles of poverty, their voices unheard in the imperial system, their suffering unnoticed by officials more concerned with their own wealth and prestige. In this context, new movements that promised radical change could easily take root, drawing disaffected peasants and scholars alike toward visions of transformation that defied the Qing status quo. Amid this backdrop of suffering, a man named Hong Xiuquan emerged. A failed civil service exam candidate from Guangdong, Hong was a devout Christian influenced by missionaries in southern China. In his dreams, he claimed to have received divine visions that would guide him to save China. Interpreting these experiences in a profoundly radical way, he began to preach that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. For many who had lost faith in the corrupt imperial system, Hong's vision offered hope, not just spiritual salvation, but also social and political liberation. The stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the empire in unprecedented violence. Hong Xiuquan's vision inspired him to establish a religious organization that would become the backbone of the Taiping Rebellion, the God-worshipping society. Founded in the late 1840s in Guangxi, this movement combined elements of Christianity with Chinese folk beliefs and millenarian ideology. Followers were drawn from the poorest strata of society, peasants, miners, and the unemployed, who saw in Hong's teachings a promise of equality and justice. The society rejected the traditional Confucian hierarchy that had long dictated social and familial relations. Instead, it promoted communal ownership, gender equality, and a strict moral code, including bans on opium, gambling, and prostitution. Women, often relegated to subordinate roles in Chinese society, found in the Taiping movement an unprecedented opportunity for empowerment. They could fight in the military, hold leadership positions, and participate fully in religious life. The society grew rapidly, fueled by Hong's charisma and the dire economic conditions of the time. By preaching salvation alongside social reform, Hong Xiuquan tapped into both the spiritual and material anxieties of the population. The movement also benefited from the fracturing of local authority. Many regions in southern China were governed by weak or corrupt officials unable to quell unrest. By 1850, the God-worshipping society had amassed thousands of followers, organized in disciplined units capable of military action. This growing strength and organization laid the foundation for what would soon become a full-scale rebellion against the Qing dynasty, one that would ultimately consume much of southern China. The transition from religious sect to revolutionary army was marked by a series of violent confrontations between the God-worshipping society and Qing forces. In January 1851, after years of preaching and mobilizing local peasants, Hong Xiuquan declared himself the Heavenly King and formally established the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. This act of defiance marked the beginning of open rebellion. The early campaigns focused on Guangxi and neighboring provinces, where the rebels leveraged local discontent to recruit additional forces. Their armies, disciplined and motivated by religious fervor, quickly gained notoriety for both their military effectiveness and their radical social policies, including the redistribution of land and wealth from the wealthy elite to commoners. Despite initial setbacks, the Taiping forces capitalized on widespread dissatisfaction with Qing rule. Local militias, poorly paid and often loyal only to regional warlords, proved ineffective against the organized and highly motivated rebels. The Qing court, initially dismissive of the movement as a mere bandit uprising, was forced to recognize the threat as the rebels captured key towns and established administrative centers. This phase of the rebellion demonstrated the potent combination of religious zeal, social reform, and military strategy, a combination that would allow the Taiping forces to challenge one of the most powerful empires in the world. By mid-1851, southern China was in chaos, and the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was no longer a fringe sect but a legitimate contender for control of the Chinese Empire. By 1852, the Taiping movement had transitioned from a local uprising to a regional force capable of challenging the Qing dynasty in southern China. The Heavenly Kingdom had established administrative centers that functioned not only as military bases, but also as social hubs where followers could organize daily life under Taiping rules. This transformation required extensive mobilization, which Hong Xiuquan and his lieutenants achieved through a combination of religious devotion, promises of social reform, and sheer organizational discipline. Recruiters traveled from village to village, preaching the ideology of the Heavenly Kingdom and offering disenfranchised peasants both spiritual salvation and a tangible path out of poverty. These recruiters emphasized the radical social changes promised by the Taiping leadership, including land redistribution, gender equality, and the abolition of oppressive local taxes. For many peasants, these promises represented a revolutionary departure from the status quo, where survival often depended on navigating a corrupt and indifferent bureaucracy. The Taiping armies were structured hierarchically, with officers chosen based on loyalty and proven capability rather than noble birth or wealth. Units were strictly disciplined, and soldiers were expected to follow both military commands and the moral code of the Heavenly Kingdom. This moral discipline, coupled with religious zeal, created a highly motivated fighting force, in stark contrast to the poorly organized and underpaid Qing militias they often confronted. Moreover, the movement's social policies strengthened the loyalty of commoners. By promoting education, providing communal food stores, and enforcing fair taxation, the Taiping leadership created a sense of legitimacy among the population. It was this combination of spiritual, social, and practical appeals that enabled the Taiping forces to grow exponentially, transforming the rebellion from a localized sect into a formidable military and political power. The expansion of the Taiping Rebellion reached its strategic and symbolic peak with the capture of Nanjing in 1853. The city, historically significant and heavily fortified, represented a key prize for any force seeking to challenge the Qing dynasty. After a series of prolonged battles and strategic maneuvers, the Taiping army, numbering tens of thousands, successfully breached Nanjing's defenses. Upon entering the city, Hong Xiuquan declared it the capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom and renamed it Tianjing, meaning Heavenly Capital. This moment was not only a military triumph, but also a symbolic declaration of the rebels' intent to replace the Qing imperial system entirely. The choice of Nanjing, rather than a northern city like Beijing, reflected both practical and ideological considerations. It was closer to the base of the movement's original support in the south, and it offered a defensible stronghold from which the Taiping could consolidate power. The establishment of Tianjing as the capital allowed the Taiping leadership to implement a full administrative system. Ministries were created to oversee finances, agriculture, law, and military operations. Officials were selected according to loyalty to the Heavenly Kingdom rather than hereditary status, marking a radical departure from traditional Qing governance. In addition to administrative reforms, the Taiping enacted sweeping social changes within Nanjing. Land was redistributed to peasants, women were granted unprecedented social and military roles, and opium, gambling, and other vices were strictly prohibited. These reforms, while controversial and sometimes brutally enforced, cemented the rebels' control over the city and enhanced their legitimacy among local populations. The capture of Nanjing signaled to the Qing dynasty that the Taiping Rebellion was no longer a regional disturbance but a direct threat to the integrity of the Chinese Empire. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom's rapid rise inevitably provoked strong reactions from the Qing dynasty. Initially, the court underestimated the threat, viewing the rebellion as an isolated disturbance in the southern provinces. However, as the rebels captured key towns, fortified cities, and strategic trade routes, the Qing government began mobilizing larger armies to suppress the insurgency. Early encounters between Qing forces and Taiping troops revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of each side. The Qing armies were often hampered by corruption, poor training, and low morale, while the Taiping forces were highly motivated, disciplined, and coordinated. Early victories by the Taiping against larger Qing contingents shocked the imperial court and emboldened the rebels, who began to believe that a full-scale overthrow of the dynasty was possible. These early confrontations also highlighted the importance of strategic planning and logistics. The Taiping leadership utilized local knowledge of terrain, rivers, and villages to conduct surprise attacks, cut supply lines, and consolidate control over captured areas. Their success in these engagements was not merely the result of numerical superiority or fanaticism, but of careful coordination, disciplined training, and adaptive tactics. On the other hand, the Qing forces' failure to adapt, coupled with internal rivalries among commanders, allowed the rebellion to grow and spread with alarming speed. By the mid-1850s, the conflict had escalated from sporadic skirmishes to a prolonged war that threatened to engulf much of southern and central China, setting the stage for one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. After capturing Nanjing and renaming it Tianjing in 1853, the Taiping leadership faced the monumental task of transforming a city into the administrative and symbolic heart of their new kingdom. Hong Xiuquan envisioned Tianjing not merely as a military stronghold, but as a shining example of the ideals of the Heavenly Kingdom. Streets were reorganized, officials appointed, and systems of law and taxation implemented. The city became a hub where the military, religious, and civil aspects of the rebellion converged, and it was here that Hong began to issue decrees designed to reshape society according to the radical principles of the movement. In Tianjing, the Taiping administration sought to implement a revolutionary social order. Land reform was central. Large estates owned by wealthy landlords were confiscated and redistributed to peasants, aiming to create economic equality. Women were granted unprecedented rights, including the ability to serve in the military, hold office, and participate fully in public life. a radical departure from Confucian norms. Education was restructured to emphasize literacy, moral instruction based on Taiping teachings, and military training. Religion remained at the core of governance. Hong's claims of divine authority and his identification as the heavenly king reinforced obedience, while elaborate rituals and ceremonies served to unite the population and strengthen ideological cohesion. Nanjing, for a time, was both a fortress and a social experiment, representing the audacious vision of a society unlike anything seen in Qing China. The social reforms introduced by the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom were as revolutionary as its military campaigns. These reforms were designed to dismantle centuries-old social hierarchies, eradicate corruption, and redistribute power to commoners. Central to this was the policy of communal living, where land, labor, and resources were shared among communities. Families were often reorganized into collective units, with property held in common and duties assigned according to ability rather than lineage. Taxation was standardized and applied more fairly than under the Qing bureaucracy, and officials were selected based on loyalty to the Heavenly Kingdom rather than wealth, connections, or examination success. Women's roles underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The Taiping movement rejected traditional gender hierarchies, allowing women to serve in both military and civil positions. Female soldiers fought alongside men in frontline battles. Female administrators ran local communities, and women were educated in literacy and moral instruction. The Taiping Moral Code prohibited practices such as foot binding, polygamy, gambling, and opium use, attempting to impose both ethical and practical discipline across society. Religious indoctrination reinforced these reforms. All citizens were expected to adhere to a strict interpretation of the Heavenly King's teachings, attend religious services, and participate in rituals that reinforced loyalty and obedience. While these policies generated widespread enthusiasm among some segments of society, they also caused resentment among traditional elites, Confucian scholars, and conservative peasants, laying the seeds for internal tension as well as external opposition. To maintain control over a growing population and territory, the Taiping leadership developed a structured administrative system modeled on both religious hierarchy and practical governance. The kingdom was divided into provinces, districts, and local communes, each supervised by officials directly accountable to the Heavenly King. Ministries were established to manage finance, agriculture, law, and military affairs, and a network of inspectors ensured adherence to both civil policies and religious observance. In theory, this bureaucracy allowed the Taiping state to function as an organized entity, capable of collecting resources, mobilizing troops, and maintaining internal stability in the midst of war. The combination of religious authority and civil administration created a unique system of governance. Officials were expected to embody the moral and ethical codes prescribed by the Taiping ideology, and any deviation from these norms was met with strict penalties. The legal system emphasized communal responsibility, obedience to religious precepts, and the eradication of corruption. Yet, this ambitious bureaucratic experiment faced significant challenges. The rapid expansion of the kingdom, coupled with ongoing military campaigns, stretched administrative capacities, and communication between central and regional authorities was often inconsistent. Additionally, factions emerged within the leadership, with personal rivalries, disputes over interpretation of doctrine, and competition for resources complicating the execution of policies. Despite these challenges, the administrative structures of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom allowed it to govern effectively over vast territories for more than a decade, demonstrating both the potential and limits of revolutionary state-building during wartime. Following the capture of Nanjing and its transformation into the heavenly capital, the Taiping forces turned their attention to expanding control along the Yangtze River, the economic and logistical lifeline of southern China. This strategic focus was crucial. Controlling the Yangtze meant access to fertile lands, trade routes, and transportation networks that could sustain a prolonged military campaign. The Taiping leadership divided their forces into highly disciplined units, each commanded by experienced officers loyal to Hong Xiuquan and committed to the ideological cause. Using both traditional infantry and riverine fleets, the rebels conducted coordinated offensives aimed at seizing key cities and towns along the river, disrupting Qing supply lines, and establishing administrative centers in newly conquered territories. The campaigns along the Yangtze were both militarily and politically significant. Militarily, the Taiping forces demonstrated remarkable flexibility, combining siege tactics, river-based maneuvers, and rapid troop movements that allowed them to outmaneuver larger but less coordinated Qing contingents. Politically, the occupation of these areas allowed the rebels to implement the social reforms of the Heavenly Kingdom, spreading their vision of equality and communal living while consolidating civilian support. Peasants in these regions, long oppressed by heavy taxation and exploitative landlords, often welcomed the rebels as liberators. The promise of land redistribution, religious guidance, and protection from local elites strengthened the legitimacy of the Taiping administration and facilitated smoother occupation of conquered territories. By controlling the Yangtze heartland, the Taiping not only secured critical resources for future campaigns, but also created a base from which their influence could radiate across southern and central China. Buoyed by successes along the Yangtze, the Taiping forces embarked on a broader campaign to extend their influence into central China. Provinces such as Anhui, Hubei, and Jiangxi became targets for both military and administrative conquest. This phase of expansion tested the organization and discipline of the Heavenly Kingdom, as larger distances, unfamiliar terrain, and varied local loyalties created complex logistical and political challenges. The Taiping armies relied on a combination of conventional warfare, local alliances, and psychological tactics, including propaganda emphasizing their divine mission and promises of social equality. Messages were sent ahead of troops, urging villagers and townspeople to welcome the Heavenly Kingdom as liberators, while threatening harsh retribution against those who resisted. Despite the careful planning, expansion into central China was met with stiff resistance. Local militias, gentry families, and Qing loyalists attempted to block the Taiping advance, creating pockets of intense fighting. Battles were often bloody, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. Yet the disciplined structure of the Taiping army, combined with the ideological zeal of its soldiers, allowed them to overcome many of these challenges. Captured towns were reorganized under Taiping administration, implementing land redistribution, gender reforms, and moral codes. These campaigns not only extended the physical reach of the rebellion, but also demonstrated the ability of the Heavenly Kingdom to govern new populations, turning military victories into lasting political and social control in contested areas. While the Taiping forces achieved remarkable expansion in the early 1850s, their military campaigns were far from unchallenged. The Qing dynasty, initially slow to respond, began to mobilize more disciplined provincial armies and engage experienced commanders to counter the insurgency. One of the key difficulties the Taiping faced was supply and logistics. Moving large numbers of troops across rivers, marshes, and mountains placed immense strain on resources, especially during prolonged sieges or extended campaigns. Troop morale could falter when soldiers faced harsh conditions or inadequate provisions, despite the unifying force of religious ideology. Additionally, the rapid expansion of territory required the establishment of garrisons, administrative offices, and communication networks, which often spread leadership thin and created vulnerabilities along the front lines. Internal challenges also emerged within the Taiping command. Ambitions among senior officers sometimes led to rivalries, and disagreements over strategy or interpretations of Hong Xiuquan's divine authority occasionally disrupted military planning. Furthermore, while peasants welcomed social reforms in many areas, Some communities resisted the imposition of strict moral codes, religious conversion, and forced conscription. These social tensions could complicate the military occupation of newly captured towns, requiring additional enforcement and diplomacy. Despite these obstacles, the Taiping armies maintained momentum, demonstrating adaptability, coordination, and a commitment to their revolutionary vision. This period of both conquest and consolidation set the stage for the eventual confrontation with Qing forces in northern China, where the stakes would become far higher and the rebellion's survival would be tested on an even grander scale. By the mid-1850s, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom had grown into a sprawling state encompassing vast portions of southern and central China. Governing such an extensive territory presented enormous administrative challenges. While the Taiping leadership had designed a structured bureaucracy with ministries overseeing finance, agriculture, law, and military affairs, the rapid expansion placed tremendous strain on these systems. Officials appointed by Hong Xiuquan were expected to be loyal, morally upright, and committed to the principles of the Heavenly Kingdom, yet the sheer number of positions required meant that inexperienced or overly ambitious individuals often assumed critical posts. Communication between the central administration in Tianjin and distant provinces was slow and unreliable, leaving local commanders with substantial autonomy. While this autonomy allowed for rapid decision-making on the battlefield, it also led to inconsistent implementation of policies and occasional abuses of power. Additionally, the demands of governance clashed with ongoing military campaigns. Soldiers were frequently required to manage both administrative and combat responsibilities, creating tension between civil duties and military obligations. Resources that were desperately needed for sieges, campaigns, or troop maintenance were sometimes diverted to maintain social programs, religious institutions, or city infrastructure. Despite these challenges, the Taiping leadership continued to emphasize moral discipline, ideological conformity, and religious devotion as the glue holding the bureaucracy together. In practice, however, the complexity of governing a revolutionary state during wartime would eventually expose structural weaknesses that contributed to internal friction and operational inefficiency. A critical challenge for the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was managing ideological unity within a rapidly growing movement. Hong Xiuquan's claim to divine authority placed him at the center of both spiritual and political life. Yet the interpretation of his teachings became a source of tension among senior leaders. Key figures such as Yang Xiuqing, Shi Dakai, and Wei Chonghui wielded considerable power, often overseeing entire military regions or provinces. Differences in strategy, governance, and religious interpretation sometimes escalated into bitter disputes. Yang Xiuqing, for example, claimed the ability to channel the voice of God directly, a claim that granted him enormous influence over both military and civilian matters. This concentration of power created rivalries and fostered a climate of suspicion, as other leaders feared the erosion of Hong's authority or their own standing within the hierarchy. Factionalism within the leadership had tangible consequences. Strategic decisions could be delayed or undermined by disagreements. Resources could be misallocated due to competing priorities, and local commanders occasionally acted independently in ways that contradicted central directives. Furthermore, ideological rigidity sometimes exacerbated these disputes. While religious orthodoxy was intended to unify the movement, divergent interpretations of Taiping doctrine fueled personal ambitions and rivalries. The combination of these political and theological tensions gradually weakened internal cohesion, sowing seeds of distrust that would later erupt into purges, betrayals, and the eventual fragmentation of the movement. For all its early successes, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was not immune to the corrosive effects of internal power struggles. Despite the impressive social reforms enacted by the Taiping regime, not all populations welcomed the radical changes imposed by the Heavenly Kingdom. In many towns and villages, traditional elites, gentry families, and Confucian scholars resisted reforms that challenged centuries of social hierarchy and cultural norms. The prohibition of practices such as foot binding, gambling, and polygamy, while ideologically aligned with Taiping principles, was often resented by communities deeply rooted in conventional customs. Additionally, compulsory military service, conscription of labor, and strict moral codes could create friction among populations unaccustomed to centralized control or revolutionary enforcement. This social resistance occasionally manifested as passive noncompliance, such as refusing to participate in religious ceremonies, avoiding military duties, or withholding taxes and resources. In some cases, localized revolts and uprisings erupted against Taiping authority, requiring military intervention to reassert control. These challenges highlighted the limits of ideological enforcement. While religious zeal and promises of social equality could mobilize followers, they could not fully suppress deeply ingrained cultural and social norms. The Taiping leadership often responded with a combination of persuasion, coercion, and violent repression, but these methods were not always effective, particularly in regions far from the central authority of Tianjin. The tension between revolutionary ideals and practical governance would remain a persistent challenge, shaping the trajectory of the rebellion and influencing both its successes and its eventual decline. By the mid-1850s, the Taiping leadership had consolidated control over much of southern and central China, establishing a strong base in Tianjin. Buoyed by military successes and growing administrative infrastructure, Hong Xiuquan and his commanders set their sights on the ultimate prize, the Qing imperial capital of Beijing. This ambition represented both a strategic and symbolic goal. Capturing Beijing would not only deal a psychological blow to the Qing dynasty, but also provide legitimacy to the Taiping claim as the ruling authority of all China. In preparation for this northern campaign, the Taiping army was reorganized, training intensified, and supply lines carefully planned to support a prolonged expedition into hostile territory. The march north was a logistical challenge of unprecedented scale. Thousands of troops, dependent on both river and land transportation, moved through regions unfamiliar with Taiping control. Armies had to navigate difficult terrain, including marshlands, rivers, and rugged hills, all while maintaining discipline and cohesion. Meanwhile, the Taiping leadership attempted to extend their ideological influence by sending envoys to villages along the route, promoting conversion to the Heavenly Kingdom's religious principles and encouraging local populations to provide supplies and recruits. While some communities welcomed these messages, others resisted, loyal to Qing authority or wary of radical reforms. The ambitious northern expedition represented a calculated gamble. Success could bring ultimate victory, but failure risked overstretching the army and exposing vulnerabilities along the southern heartland. As the Taiping forces advanced toward northern China, they encountered increasingly organized resistance from Qing armies. Unlike the disorganized local militias of the south, northern Qing forces were commanded by experienced generals and benefited from more reliable supply lines and fortified positions. These armies employed a combination of defensive tactics, including fortified city garrisons, river blockades, and coordinated counterattacks designed to slow the Taiping advance. The rebels, despite their discipline and ideological fervor, faced mounting challenges as they moved further from their logistical base in Tianjin. Several critical battles during this northern campaign demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the Taiping military. While the army's rigid discipline, coordination, and morale allowed it to achieve tactical victories, these successes often came at enormous cost in casualties and resources. Extended supply lines left the Taiping forces vulnerable to ambushes and sabotage, while the harsh northern terrain complicated both movement and communication. Moreover, the further the army moved from southern strongholds, the less effective its ideological appeal became, as local populations were often resistant to rapid cultural and social reforms. Despite these challenges, the Northern Campaign demonstrated the audacity and organizational capacity of the Taiping forces, showing that they could project power far beyond their initial southern base and challenge Qing dominance on multiple fronts simultaneously. While the northern expeditions showcased the ambition and resilience of the Taiping leadership, they also revealed the inherent limits of the rebellion's expansionist strategy. Operating far from Tianjin created immense logistical difficulties, including shortages of food, munitions, and medical supplies. Communication with Central Command became unreliable, making coordinated action challenging. Additionally, extended campaigns increased exposure to disease, desertion, and the strain of prolonged combat, gradually eroding the effectiveness of the army. The further the Taiping forces pushed into northern territories, the more difficult it became to maintain both administrative control and ideological cohesion among conquered populations. Strategic overreach also intensified internal tensions within the Taiping leadership. Senior commanders disagreed over priorities, including whether to press aggressively toward Beijing or consolidate power in the south and central regions. Hong Xiuquan's reliance on religious authority to maintain unity was increasingly tested, as disagreements over tactics, governance, and interpretation of doctrine fueled rivalries and mistrust. Moreover, the Northern campaigns exposed vulnerabilities in the Taiping military system. While the army excelled in swift, decisive engagements, it struggled with prolonged sieges, urban combat, and coordination across vast distances. By the late 1850s, it became evident that while the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom had grown into a formidable force, its reach was pushing the limits of sustainability, and the Qing dynasty, recovering from initial setbacks, was beginning to exploit these weaknesses with renewed vigor. By the late 1850s, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom had expanded across vast swathes of southern and central China, but internal leadership conflicts began to threaten the cohesion of the movement. Hong Xiuquan remained the central figure, both spiritually and politically, but powerful lieutenants like Yang Xiuqing, Shi Dakai, and Wei Chonghui had established significant independent authority. These leaders commanded armies, managed regions, and controlled logistics, giving them power that sometimes rivaled Hong's own. Yang Xiuqing, in particular, leveraged his claim of divine inspiration to exert enormous influence over military and administrative decisions, often making unilateral choices that sparked resentment among other leaders. Disagreements over strategy, governance, and succession created an atmosphere of suspicion and tension, particularly as the movement faced increasingly organized resistance from Qing forces. Factionalism within the leadership was exacerbated by ideological rigidity. Leaders interpreted Hong Xiuquan's teachings differently, resulting in conflicting directives for both governance and military campaigns. Some advocated for aggressive expansion into northern territories, while others urged consolidation of existing territories to maintain stability. Personal ambitions intertwined with these ideological differences, creating a toxic mix that threatened strategic coherence. The growing mistrust among senior officials also affected lower-ranking commanders, who began to align themselves with particular factions, reducing the overall effectiveness of the army. This period marked the beginning of a dangerous internal erosion, setting the stage for violent purges that would fundamentally weaken the Taiping command structure. In response to mounting rivalries and perceived threats to central authority, Hong Xiuquan and his inner circle initiated a series of brutal purges aimed at eliminating potential challengers. One of the most infamous incidents involved the extermination of Yang Xiuqing in 1856. Accused of attempting to usurp Hong's divine authority, Yang and his family were executed, along with numerous followers loyal to him. This action, while consolidating Hong's personal power, sent shockwaves throughout the Taiping leadership and army. Fear and paranoia spread quickly as senior officers realized that disloyalty, or even perceived disloyalty, could result in immediate execution. The purges were not limited to Hong Xiuquan. Shi Dakai, another senior commander, eventually withdrew from the capital, citing distrust of the central leadership, further fracturing unity. Wei Chonghui, who had initially supported the purges, became a target himself, highlighting the cyclical and indiscriminate nature of the violence. These internal purges had a devastating effect on both morale and administrative efficiency. Talented leaders were lost, institutional knowledge was disrupted, and the military suffered from lack of coordination. While the Heavenly Kingdom survived these purges in the short term, the long-term consequences were severe, as the movement's ability to govern conquered territories and conduct effective military operations steadily declined. The internal purges and leadership conflicts fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Taiping Rebellion. The removal of experienced commanders weakened both strategic planning and battlefield effectiveness, leaving the army more vulnerable to Qing counterattacks. Administrative chaos emerged in regions distant from Tianjin, where local leaders struggled to enforce social reforms and maintain public order. The moral authority of Hong Xiuquan, once the unifying force of the rebellion, began to be questioned by both followers and senior officials. Fear and mistrust replaced confidence and loyalty, creating divisions that would persist for the remainder of the conflict. Moreover, these internal struggles undermined popular support in occupied territories. While many peasants initially welcomed Taiping reforms, the violence and unpredictability of the purges alarmed communities that had pledged allegiance to the Heavenly Kingdom. Resistance, both passive and active, increased in several regions, requiring additional military resources to maintain control. The combination of internal leadership crises, administrative inefficiency, and growing local resistance revealed a critical weakness. The Taiping movement's reliance on centralized charisma and rigid ideology made it fragile in the face of internal dissent. As the 1860s approached, these vulnerabilities would be exploited by Qing forces, foreign mercenaries, and local militias, ultimately contributing to the gradual collapse of the rebellion. By the late 1850s, the Qing dynasty, initially overwhelmed by the rapid expansion of the Taiping forces, began to recover and reorganize. After early setbacks, the court realized that conventional provincial militias and poorly coordinated armies were insufficient to defeat the well-disciplined Taiping forces. In response, the Qing leadership, including the influential Manchu and Han elite, initiated a strategy of decentralization, relying on regional commanders with significant autonomy to lead counteroffensives. These commanders, often wealthy gentry or local leaders, were tasked with raising armies from their own territories, equipping them at their own expense, and engaging Taiping forces with a combination of traditional military tactics and pragmatic innovations. This approach marked a turning point in the conflict. By granting substantial autonomy to regional armies, the Qing dynasty leveraged local knowledge, loyalty, and resources to create forces that were more agile, motivated, and capable than the early imperial troops. One of the most prominent examples was Zhang Guofan, who organized the Xiong army from Hunan province. The Xiong army became a model of disciplined, ideologically motivated regional forces, combining Confucian loyalty with effective military organization. Qing forces now possessed a mixture of conventional armies, regional militias, and experienced commanders, all operating with a common goal: to reclaim territory lost to the Taiping and restore imperial authority. This strategic reorganization, coupled with lessons learned from prior defeats, laid the foundation for a sustained counteroffensive that would eventually challenge the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom on multiple fronts. The Taiping Rebellion coincided with a period of increasing foreign involvement in China. British and French forces, already engaged in the Opium Wars and expanding trade influence, observed the rebellion with a mix of caution and opportunism. Initially, some foreign traders and missionaries sympathized with the Taiping cause, viewing it as a movement with Christian overtones, albeit distorted in its ideology. However, As the rebellion expanded and threatened ports, trade routes, and foreign interests, Western powers increasingly sided with the Qing dynasty, protecting commercial interests, maintaining access to ports, and ensuring the stability of China as a trading partner became priorities, prompting direct and indirect intervention. Foreign involvement took several forms. British and French officers provided military advice, helped train Qing troops, and, in some cases, supplied weapons and logistical support. These contributions enhanced the Qing's ability to resist Taiping advances, particularly in strategic coastal cities and river networks critical for trade. Moreover, foreign powers occasionally acted as neutral arbiters or brokers, attempting to stabilize conflict zones to prevent disruption of commerce. The presence of foreign-backed troops and advisors gradually tilted the balance of power in favor of the Qing, complicating Taiping military strategy and further highlighting the limits of their northern and central campaigns. This interplay between domestic rebellion and foreign influence underscores the complex geopolitical context of the Taiping Rebellion, in which international dynamics increasingly shaped the outcome of internal conflict. As Qing forces, regional armies, and foreign advisors began coordinating counterattacks, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom faced mounting strategic pressure, particularly in and around Tianjin. The capital, once secure and heavily fortified, now found itself under the threat of encirclement. The prolonged northern campaigns and internal purges had weakened the army's effectiveness, leaving gaps in defense lines that could be exploited by organized and well-supplied Qing armies. Reinforcements from southern regions became increasingly difficult to mobilize due to distance, logistical strain, and the fragmentation of command caused by earlier factional disputes. The psychological impact of this pressure was significant. Soldiers who had once been motivated by religious zeal and revolutionary enthusiasm now faced uncertainty, fatigue, and fear. Civilians in occupied areas, witnessing both military losses and internal purges, began questioning the stability of the Heavenly Kingdom. The combination of external military threats, internal leadership crises, and social unrest created a perfect storm that would increasingly define the final decade of the rebellion. The strategic pressure on Tianjin marked the beginning of a slow, grinding process in which the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom strengths were systematically tested and, ultimately, eroded by a combination of sustained military campaigns, internal division, and the intervention of foreign powers. By the early 1860s, the momentum of the Taiping Rebellion began to shift decisively against the rebels. After years of expansion and consolidation, the Qing dynasty and its regional armies launched systematic campaigns to reclaim territory lost to the Heavenly Kingdom. Provinces such as Hubei and Anhui, which had been early targets of Taiping expansion, became focal points for strategic offensives. The Qing forces, led by capable commanders like Zhang Guofan, combined disciplined infantry with river fleets and artillery to outmaneuver and isolate Taiping troops. Unlike the early chaotic engagements, these battles were carefully planned, with logistics, intelligence, and local alliances ensuring that the Qing maintained the upper hand. The Taiping forces, while still motivated by religious zeal, faced severe challenges. Extended supply lines, compounded by the long northern campaigns and prior internal purges, reduced the army's operational efficiency. Units were often overextended, forced to defend large swathes of territory without adequate reinforcements or provisions. Furthermore, the strict moral and ideological codes that had once unified the army now limited flexibility, as commanders hesitated to take unconventional actions that might be seen as violating Taiping principles. Local populations, initially supportive due to land redistribution and social reforms, sometimes withdrew assistance or even collaborated with Qing forces to end the disruptive occupation. The result was a series of bloody battles in which the Taiping forces were increasingly pushed back, marking the beginning of a gradual but relentless retreat. The loss of key urban centers was a major blow to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Cities that had served as administrative hubs and resource centers, critical to both military operations and governance, fell to Qing counteroffensives. In many cases, the rebels were forced to abandon heavily fortified positions after prolonged sieges, facing shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The retreat from these cities was often chaotic, with thousands of soldiers and civilians moving simultaneously, vulnerable to ambushes and harassment by pursuing Qing forces. The psychological impact on both troops and civilians was profound. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Heavenly Kingdom since the capture of Nanjing began to dissipate, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The retreat also exposed flaws in Taiping leadership. With senior commanders lost to purges, defections, or battlefield deaths, coordination became increasingly difficult. Regional leaders, operating with significant autonomy, often pursued defensive strategies that conflicted with central directives, further weakening the army's cohesion. Civilians, disillusioned by the inability of the Taiping forces to maintain control and enforce reforms, began abandoning or resisting the rebels. In these circumstances, the retreat from strategic cities was not just a military maneuver, but also a crisis of governance and morale, highlighting the fragility of the Heavenly Kingdom in the face of sustained pressure from both internal and external adversaries. As Qing forces advanced, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom increasingly relied on fortified cities and defensive positions to slow the imperial counteroffensive. Prolonged sieges became a hallmark of this stage of the rebellion, with both sides suffering enormous casualties. Taiping forces attempted to fortify key strongholds, using walls, trenches, and river defenses to repel Qing advances. Despite these efforts, the combination of superior artillery, well-supplied troops, and strategic coordination by Qing commanders gradually eroded Taiping positions. Starvation, disease, and desertion further weakened the defenders, creating conditions in which even the most fortified cities eventually succumbed to the pressure. The protracted nature of these sieges had profound social and psychological effects. Civilians trapped within besieged cities faced extreme hardship, including famine and outbreaks of disease. Soldiers, already strained by years of continuous warfare, struggled to maintain discipline and morale. Religious fervor, once a unifying force, increasingly gave way to fear and despair as the Heavenly Kingdom's territorial losses mounted. These prolonged sieges demonstrated both the resilience and the limitations of the Taiping military system. While it could hold ground temporarily and resist superior forces for months, it was ultimately unsustainable in the face of coordinated, resource-rich counterattacks. By the mid-1860s, the stage was set for the final collapse of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, as internal weaknesses, military defeats, and external pressures converged to bring the rebellion to its devastating conclusion. By the early 1860s, the Qing counteroffensive had reached the gates of Tianjin, the capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. After nearly a decade of rebellion, Nanjing had become a symbol of Taiping authority, ideology, and governance. Its fall would not only represent a strategic loss, but also a psychological blow to the entire movement. The Qing forces, led by regional armies such as Zhang Guofan's Xiong Army, meticulously organized the siege, cutting off supply lines and reinforcing their artillery positions along the Yangtze River. River fleets controlled access points, preventing reinforcements or critical resources from reaching the city. The Taiping defenders, though fiercely loyal, faced dwindling supplies, disease, and the exhaustion of continuous warfare. Inside Tianjin, internal tensions further weakened the city's defenses. The purges of the previous decade had eliminated many experienced commanders, leaving inexperienced leaders to manage complex fortifications and coordinate troops under extreme pressure. Civilians, who had once supported the Taiping reforms, began to despair as food shortages worsened and violence escalated. The city's population, including soldiers and ordinary citizens, faced the stark reality that the heavenly kingdom's dream of a utopian society was being extinguished before their eyes. The siege of Tianjin became a prolonged and brutal ordeal, with both defenders and attackers suffering immense casualties, marking a pivotal moment in the long and bloody conflict between the Taiping rebels and the Qing dynasty. As the siege continued, the internal cohesion of the Taiping leadership deteriorated rapidly. Hong Xiuquan's health and mental state had declined over the years, weakening his ability to inspire, govern, and make strategic decisions. Senior commanders, already weakened by purges and infighting, struggled to maintain discipline and manage resources. Fear, distrust, and desperation pervaded the ranks, eroding morale and creating openings for Qing forces to exploit. Soldiers who had once fought with unwavering religious zeal began to surrender, desert, or act independently, further fracturing the defensive effort. Leadership despair extended to administrative functions as well. Critical decisions such as rationing food, coordinating reinforcements, or maintaining medical care for the wounded became increasingly chaotic. Religious rituals, once a source of unity and inspiration, now served as reminders of promises unfulfilled. Civilian support dwindled, and attempts to maintain ideological conformity became increasingly unenforceable. The combination of external military pressure and internal collapse meant that Tianjin's defenders were fighting not just an external enemy but also the gradual disintegration of their own organization. This dual crisis, both physical and psychological, hastened the fall of the city, signaling the imminent end of the heavenly kingdom as a functioning state. In 1864, after months of grueling siege warfare, Tianjin finally fell to Qing forces, marking the catastrophic collapse of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The city, once a model of radical social reform and revolutionary ideology, was captured through relentless military pressure, careful coordination, and overwhelming force. Historical accounts describe massive casualties. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perished during the final assault and in the chaos that followed. Leaders of the Taiping movement, including remaining senior commanders, were either killed in battle, executed, or committed suicide to avoid capture. Hong Xiuquan had died shortly before the fall, leaving the movement leaderless at its most critical moment. The fall of Tianjin effectively ended organized Taiping resistance, although remnants of the movement continued sporadic fighting in isolated regions for a few more years. The destruction of the capital symbolized the failure of a movement that had once seemed capable of overturning the Qing dynasty and transforming Chinese society. The social reforms, religious experimentation, and revolutionary ideals of the Heavenly Kingdom were largely extinguished, replaced by Qing reassertion of authority and punitive measures against surviving rebels. The fall of Tianjin stands as one of the most dramatic and tragic moments in Chinese history, representing both the extraordinary ambition of the Taiping Rebellion and the devastating consequences of internal division, military overreach, and relentless opposition. The Taiping Rebellion, which raged from 1850 to 1864, left a staggering human toll, making it one of the deadliest civil wars in history. Estimates suggest that the conflict resulted in the deaths of 20 to 30 million people, including soldiers, civilians, and those caught in the crossfire of prolonged sieges and military campaigns. Entire towns and villages were depopulated, either through direct violence, forced conscription, or mass flight from areas of conflict. The collapse of social order in contested regions led to widespread famine, disease, and displacement. Crops were destroyed, irrigation systems fell into neglect, and trade routes became dangerous or unusable, further exacerbating the suffering of ordinary people. The human cost was compounded by the methods of warfare employed by both sides. Taiping forces, though motivated by revolutionary zeal, often used harsh measures to enforce loyalty and maintain control over occupied territories. Civilians who resisted conversion, social reforms, or conscription were punished, sometimes brutally. Similarly, Qing forces, seeking to suppress the rebellion, employed scorched earth tactics, massacres, and punitive measures that decimated populations suspected of supporting the Taiping. The combined impact of military operations, famine, disease, and social disruption created a level of suffering unmatched in most contemporary conflicts, leaving a generational scar on China's demographic and cultural landscape. Beyond the immediate human toll, the Taiping Rebellion caused massive economic and infrastructural devastation. Agriculture, the backbone of China's economy, was severely disrupted. Fields were abandoned, irrigation channels destroyed, and livestock decimated. Trade along rivers, especially the Yangtze, was interrupted by sieges, naval blockades, and widespread insecurity. Cities that had once functioned as commercial and administrative hubs were reduced to rubble, including towns that had served as regional centers under the Taiping administration. The destruction of infrastructure compounded shortages of food, fuel, and other essential goods, creating a cycle of deprivation that lasted for years after the rebellion ended. Furthermore, the rebellion disrupted taxation systems, revenue collection, and local governance, leading to widespread fiscal instability. Both the Qing administration and regional governments faced enormous costs in rebuilding armies, restoring cities, and repairing critical infrastructure. Communities that had initially benefited from Taiping reforms, such as land redistribution or increased local autonomy, often saw those gains reversed violently once the Qing reasserted control. This economic devastation not only slowed post-rebellion recovery but also contributed to long-term instability in southern and central China, leaving entire regions impoverished and undermining the social and political legitimacy of both the Qing state and local authorities. The Taiping Rebellion also had profound social and cultural consequences. Its radical reforms, which challenged traditional Confucian hierarchies, gender roles, and religious practices, left an enduring mark on Chinese society. Women had been granted unprecedented rights, including participation in the military and local governance, and the attempt to eliminate practices such as foot binding, gambling, and polygamy represented a bold experiment in social restructuring. While these reforms were ultimately suppressed after the rebellion, they demonstrated the possibility of transformative social change in a society long governed by entrenched traditions. Culturally, the rebellion's fusion of Christianity-inspired ideology with revolutionary zeal challenged the authority of both Confucian scholars and the Qing court. Taiping literature, proclamations, and religious texts spread ideas of equality, moral discipline, and divine mission across the territories under rebel control. The rebellion also influenced future revolutionary movements in China, providing lessons in both the potential and limitations of large-scale insurgency, ideological governance, and social reform. While the immediate aftermath was one of devastation and repression, the Taiping Rebellion left an indelible imprint on Chinese consciousness, shaping the discourse of reform, resistance, and revolutionary possibility for decades to come. The Taiping Rebellion coincided with a period of intense foreign involvement in China, and the aftermath of the rebellion further highlighted the role of Western powers in shaping the Qing dynasty's recovery. During the conflict, Britain and France, concerned about trade and security in treaty ports, had sided with the Qing government, providing military assistance, training, and logistical support. Following the fall of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, foreign powers maintained a strategic presence in China, ensuring stability along major trade routes and protecting their economic interests. British and French military advisors helped modernize Qing forces, emphasizing artillery, firearms, and tactical coordination, which not only aided in post-rebellion pacification but also laid the groundwork for a more professionalized regional military structure. The Qing court, recovering from the massive loss of life and territory, relied heavily on these foreign alliances to consolidate control. While the central authority remained weakened, regional commanders who had raised their own armies during the rebellion retained significant autonomy, creating a decentralized power structure that foreign powers could influence indirectly. The restoration of Qing authority in southern and central China was thus not solely a domestic achievement. It was facilitated by a combination of regional military initiative and foreign intervention, illustrating the growing entanglement of China with global geopolitical forces in the mid-19th century. This set a precedent for later foreign involvement in Chinese affairs, particularly as the Qing state sought assistance in suppressing future uprisings and managing internal instability. The devastation wrought by the Taiping Rebellion necessitated an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Cities, towns, and villages that had been destroyed or depopulated faced the immense challenge of rebuilding both physical infrastructure and social cohesion. Critical transport routes, including roads, bridges, and river channels, had to be repaired to facilitate the movement of goods, troops, and civilians. Irrigation systems, essential for agricultural productivity, were reconstructed to revive farming in regions that had experienced years of neglect or active destruction. Public buildings, including administrative offices, schools, and temples, were rebuilt to restore governance, education, and cultural life. Local populations, though traumatized by years of war, were gradually reintegrated into social and economic systems. Communities that had supported the Taiping reforms often faced retribution, including confiscation of property, punitive taxation, or forced compliance with Qing-imposed social norms. Despite these challenges, reconstruction efforts were largely successful in restoring a measure of stability, particularly in strategically important cities along the Yangtze River. The combination of local initiative, regional military oversight, and foreign technical expertise allowed the Qing to reestablish functional governance, even as the human and economic costs of the rebellion continued to affect society for decades. The Taiping Rebellion had lasting geopolitical consequences that extended beyond the immediate destruction of China. The reliance on foreign military support demonstrated the increasing influence of Western powers in domestic Chinese affairs, creating a precedent for intervention in future conflicts. Treaty ports, initially established after the Opium Wars, became critical nodes for monitoring trade and military activity, and foreign powers leveraged these positions to exert influence over Qing governance and regional security. The success of regional armies, trained and sometimes assisted by foreign officers, shifted the balance of power within China, weakening central authority while empowering provincial commanders who could negotiate directly with both the imperial court and foreign entities. Moreover, the rebellion highlighted China's vulnerability to internal insurgencies and the importance of modern military organization, intelligence, and logistics. Future rebellions and foreign conflicts would exploit similar weaknesses, shaping the strategies of both domestic and foreign actors in the latter half of the 19th century. The lessons learned from the Taiping Rebellion about the integration of ideology, social reform, and military organization resonated with subsequent reform movements and revolutionary thinkers. The interplay between domestic upheaval and foreign involvement fundamentally altered China's political landscape, setting the stage for continued social unrest, modernization efforts, and the eventual collapse of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century. The Taiping Rebellion, despite ending in catastrophic failure, represented one of the most ambitious social experiments in Chinese history. The Heavenly Kingdom sought to overturn centuries of entrenched social hierarchy, Confucian traditions, and patriarchal norms. Land was redistributed from wealthy landlords to peasants, aiming to reduce economic inequality and empower common people. Communities were reorganized into collective units where labor, resources, and property were shared. Women were granted unprecedented rights, including participation in military campaigns, administrative duties, and education. Foot-binding, gambling, and polygamy were banned, and citizens were required to adhere to strict moral and religious codes. Although these reforms were largely rolled back following the Qing Restoration, they demonstrated the possibility of alternative social structures. Scholars, reformers, and revolutionaries in later decades looked back on the Taiping experiment as evidence that radical change was conceivable in China, even if it required extraordinary circumstances and leadership. The emphasis on communal living, gender equality, and moral discipline, while extreme and often coercive, challenged traditional norms and provided a blueprint for thinking about society in transformative ways. For many, the Taiping movement exemplified both the promise and peril of ideological zeal applied to governance, leaving a complex legacy that inspired admiration, fear, and debate for generations. The ideological and organizational elements of the Taiping Rebellion resonated with later revolutionary movements in China. Leaders and thinkers in the late Qing and early Republican periods studied the rebellion as a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. The combination of religious fervor, charismatic leadership, and mass mobilization demonstrated how ideas could motivate millions to challenge a centuries-old dynasty. While subsequent movements rejected the Taiping's religious framework, they often sought to replicate the combination of ideological appeal, social reform, and military organization that allowed the rebels to control vast territories for more than a decade. Revolutionaries such as Sun Yat-sen and members of early reformist societies drew lessons from both the successes and failures of the Taiping movement. The rebellion highlighted the importance of cohesive leadership, strategic planning, and the careful integration of social reform with military objectives. At the same time, it underscored the dangers of internal factionalism, ideological rigidity, and overextension. In this sense, the Taiping Rebellion served as a formative event in Chinese revolutionary thought, illustrating the potential for mass movements to reshape society and the risks inherent in large-scale insurgencies against entrenched dynastic powers. The Taiping Rebellion also left a profound mark on Chinese cultural memory and historiography. Contemporary observers, Qing officials, foreign diplomats, and missionaries documented the rebellion in detail, providing accounts that emphasized both the brutality of the conflict and the idealism of the movement. In Chinese historiography, the rebellion has been interpreted in multiple ways: as a catastrophic civil war, a failed utopian experiment, and a precursor to modern revolutionary movements. These interpretations often reflect broader debates about the role of ideology, social reform, and mass mobilization in Chinese history. Art, literature, and folklore preserve the memory of the rebellion, portraying both heroism and tragedy. Taiping leaders were simultaneously vilified and romanticized, depending on the perspective of chroniclers. The rebellion's scale, its social experiments, and the extraordinary ambition of Hong Xiuquan and his followers ensured that the movement remained a subject of fascination, study, and moral reflection. Its legacy persists not only in academic discourse but also in popular memory, influencing debates about governance, social reform, and the capacity for revolutionary change in China. The Taiping Rebellion, despite its destruction, continues to serve as a lens through which historians, policymakers, and cultural commentators examine the challenges and possibilities of profound societal transformation. Even after the fall of Tianjin in 1864, remnants of the Taiping forces continued to resist Qing authority in isolated pockets across southern and central China. These scattered groups, often composed of former soldiers, local supporters, and displaced civilians, attempted to regroup under local leaders, hoping to reignite the rebellion. While these forces were never able to achieve the scale or coordination of the original movement, they remained a persistent threat to Qing control for several years. These remnants relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushing Qing patrols, raiding villages, and exploiting difficult terrain to evade capture. The fragmented nature of these forces made them both dangerous and unstable. Without central leadership, ideological cohesion weakened, and local commanders often acted independently, prioritizing survival or personal gain over collective strategy. Supplies were scarce, and many combatants faced starvation, disease, and desertion. Yet, the continued resistance demonstrated the resilience of Taiping ideology and the enduring appeal of social reforms among certain populations. Even in defeat, the remnants symbolized the persistent challenge of governing a vast and culturally diverse empire, highlighting the Qing dynasty's ongoing struggle to consolidate power and enforce order across previously rebel-held regions. Beyond organized Taiping remnants, the social and economic disruptions caused by the rebellion sparked additional localized uprisings. Communities devastated by years of warfare, famine, and dislocation occasionally rose in revolt against Qing officials, landlords, or local gentry. These uprisings were fueled by lingering resentment, the breakdown of traditional social structures, and the desire to resist punitive measures imposed during the suppression of the rebellion. While smaller than the Taiping insurgency, these local revolts were difficult to suppress, requiring regional armies to maintain security and rebuild order. These uprisings underscored the long-term social consequences of the Taiping conflict. Villages that had initially supported the rebellion often faced harsh retribution, creating cycles of resentment and rebellion that persisted for years. The Qing government, relying heavily on regional armies and local militias, struggled to balance punitive measures with reconstruction efforts. Economic recovery, the reestablishment of taxation systems, and the restoration of civil governance became intertwined with the ongoing management of unrest, demonstrating that the end of large-scale military conflict did not equate to immediate societal stability. Despite the military defeat of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, elements of its ideology persisted. Former followers, inspired by the vision of equality, religious guidance, and social reform, occasionally attempted to establish new movements based on Taiping principles. Some of these efforts involved attempts to rebuild communities following the model of the Heavenly Kingdom, emphasizing communal land ownership, gender equality, and moral discipline. While these revival attempts were never successful on a large scale, they contributed to the continuing influence of Taiping thought on later reformist and revolutionary movements. The persistence of Taiping ideology also influenced cultural and intellectual discourse in China. The rebellion demonstrated the power of combining religious or ideological zeal with organized military and social reform, a concept that future revolutionary thinkers adapted to secular or nationalist frameworks. Reformers and revolutionaries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often referenced the Taiping example to illustrate both the possibilities and dangers of radical change. In this way, the rebellion's ideological legacy outlasted its military and political defeat, ensuring that the principles of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom continued to shape debates about social justice, governance, and revolutionary potential in China for decades. The devastation wrought by the Taiping Rebellion exposed serious deficiencies in the Qing dynasty's military system, prompting a period of profound reflection and reform. The imperial forces, initially outmatched by the disciplined and ideologically motivated Taiping armies, suffered repeated defeats due to lack of organization, poor leadership, and inadequate logistics. These failures demonstrated the limitations of traditional Qing military structures, which relied heavily on provincial militias, hereditary units, and loosely coordinated armies with inconsistent training. The massive scale of the rebellion and the inability of centralized forces to respond effectively revealed the urgent need for systemic changes in both recruitment and command structures. In response, the Qing government increasingly relied on regional armies raised and maintained by local gentry and officials, such as Zhang Guofan's Xiong Army and Li Hongzhang's Huai Army. These forces were better trained, better disciplined, and more motivated than earlier imperial troops, often combining Confucian loyalty with practical military expertise. They emphasized coordination between infantry, artillery, and river fleets, reflecting lessons learned from prolonged sieges and urban combat against the Taiping. The success of these regional armies illustrated the importance of combining centralized oversight with localized initiative, laying the groundwork for a new model of military organization that could be adapted to both internal rebellions and foreign threats. The Taiping Rebellion also catalyzed the Qing dynasty's engagement with Western military practices. Observing the effectiveness of firearms, artillery, and disciplined infantry tactics during the conflict, Qing leaders began incorporating Western training methods, technology, and organizational principles into their armies. Foreign advisors, many of whom had assisted in suppressing the rebellion, played a crucial role in this process, providing technical expertise, strategic guidance, and direct training for troops. This marked a departure from reliance on traditional military norms and highlighted the potential benefits of integrating foreign military knowledge with local command structures. These modernization efforts extended beyond equipment and tactics to include logistics, intelligence, and administrative coordination. Armies were reorganized with clear hierarchies, standardized training regimens, and improved supply chains. Riverine and naval capabilities were enhanced to control trade routes and protect strategic regions, addressing vulnerabilities exposed during Taiping campaigns. By integrating Western methods with local knowledge and loyalty structures, the Qing created a hybrid military model capable of responding to both internal uprisings and external threats. The rebellion, though catastrophic, thus indirectly accelerated the modernization of Chinese military institutions, setting the stage for the Qing's limited successes in later conflicts and influencing the development of modern Chinese armed forces. The reforms inspired by the Taiping Rebellion had profound long-term implications for China's military and political landscape. The reliance on regional armies empowered local commanders, creating a decentralization that both strengthened and challenged Qing authority. On one hand, these armies effectively suppressed rebellions and defended critical regions. On the other, they became politically influential entities capable of negotiating directly with the central court, sometimes independently of imperial directives. This shift contributed to a more complex balance of power within China, where regional leaders could wield substantial influence over national policy. Additionally, the emphasis on modernization and Western techniques provided a blueprint for later military and technological reforms, influencing the self-strengthening movement and early 20th century attempts to create a modern, professional army. The rebellion's lessons on logistics, troop morale, and the integration of ideology with military objectives informed subsequent approaches to governance and military strategy. In this sense, the Taiping Rebellion, despite its devastating consequences, acted as a catalyst for institutional evolution, compelling the Qing dynasty and later Chinese leaders to adapt to the challenges of internal upheaval, foreign intervention, and the demands of modern warfare. The Taiping Rebellion caused one of the most severe demographic crises in Chinese history. With estimates of 20 to 30 million deaths, entire provinces experienced drastic population declines, particularly in southern and central China, including Hunan, Jiangxi, Anhui, and Guangxi. Villages and towns were depopulated due to mass killings, sieges, and the widespread famine that accompanied years of warfare. Agricultural collapse, destruction of irrigation systems, and the burning of crops led to chronic food shortages, exacerbating mortality from disease and starvation. Mass migration became a defining feature of the post-rebellion period. Survivors fled devastated regions, moving to less affected areas or seeking refuge in cities that were partially intact. This migration disrupted local economies, social hierarchies, and cultural traditions, creating pockets of displaced populations that often faced hostility or suspicion from local authorities and residents. Returning to ancestral lands was difficult, as fields, homes, and community structures were destroyed. These movements contributed to long-term demographic shifts, altering population densities, labor distribution, and regional power dynamics, and leaving a legacy of social instability that persisted for decades. The prolonged conflict also had profound cultural consequences. Temples, schools, libraries, and administrative buildings were destroyed or repurposed during the fighting, resulting in the loss of historical records, local governance structures, and educational infrastructure. The Taiping's radical social reforms, while temporary, disrupted traditional Confucian social hierarchies, including family authority, gender roles, and local leadership. Women, who had participated in military and administrative roles under the Heavenly Kingdom, were largely forced back into traditional roles after the rebellion, creating a jarring reversal of social expectations. Religious practices, particularly those associated with Confucianism, Buddhism, and local folk traditions, were also affected. The Taiping's Christian-inspired ideology suppressed traditional religious rituals, and temples were often destroyed or converted into administrative centers. The violent nature of the rebellion, combined with punitive measures by Qing authorities after the fall of Tianjin, created a climate of fear and repression, further eroding traditional cultural practices. Despite this, some elements of Taiping reform, particularly the emphasis on literacy, morality, and social discipline, left lasting impressions on communities, influencing local cultural norms and contributing to evolving debates about social reform in the late Qing period. The demographic and cultural devastation of the Taiping Rebellion prompted a slow but significant restructuring of Chinese society. Land redistribution, though largely reversed, forced landlords and local elites to reconsider property management and tenant relations. Regional gentry who had raised armies during the rebellion consolidated their authority, blending military, economic, and administrative power in ways that reshaped local governance. Communities had to adapt to reduced populations, disrupted trade, and altered labor patterns, fostering both resilience and innovation in surviving towns and villages. These social adjustments also influenced broader political structures. The reliance on regional armies and local elites during and after the rebellion demonstrated the limits of centralized control and reinforced the importance of local governance in maintaining order. Survivors of the rebellion carried forward lessons in self-sufficiency, communal support, and strategic cooperation, creating informal networks that supported recovery and stability. In this way, the rebellion, despite its catastrophic human cost, accelerated social evolution, forcing communities and elites alike to adapt to new demographic realities, reshaped power structures, and altered the trajectory of Chinese society for decades to come. The Taiping Rebellion, despite ending in catastrophic defeat, served as a powerful model for subsequent uprisings in China. Its unprecedented scale, combination of ideological motivation, and revolutionary social reforms demonstrated how a movement could mobilize millions against the established order. Leaders of later uprisings studied the Taiping's successes and failures, particularly the role of charismatic leadership, religious or ideological zeal, and the integration of social reform with military strategy. While future movements abandoned the religious underpinnings of the Heavenly Kingdom, they often adopted its organizational methods, including mass mobilization, territorial administration, and propaganda to inspire loyalty. The rebellion also highlighted the importance of central cohesion and disciplined command. Many later insurgencies suffered from fragmentation, desertion, and leadership rivalries, lessons painfully illustrated by the internal purges and factionalism within the Taiping leadership. Revolutionary thinkers and reformers in the late Qing period recognized that ideology alone was insufficient to maintain control without competent military, logistical, and administrative structures. Thus, the Taiping Rebellion functioned as both inspiration and cautionary tale, shaping the strategies of anti-Qing movements and informing the intellectual framework of Chinese revolutionary thought in the decades leading up to the 1911 revolution. In the decades following the fall of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, China experienced a series of localized uprisings, many influenced by the memory of the rebellion. These included the Nanjing Rebellion in northern China, the Miao uprisings in Guizhou, and other smaller revolts against Qing taxation, land disputes, and social oppression. While these uprisings lacked the scale and ideological unity of the Taiping movement, they often reflected its principles, such as anti-corruption rhetoric, community solidarity, and challenges to entrenched social hierarchies. Former Taiping soldiers and sympathizers sometimes participated in these revolts, carrying forward the lessons learned during the rebellion in terms of organization, military tactics, and propaganda. The Qing dynasty's reliance on regional armies to suppress these uprisings demonstrated a structural legacy of the Taiping conflict. The success of provincial commanders in raising disciplined militias underscored the value of decentralized military power combined with local knowledge. However, this reliance also reinforced the fragmentation of authority, creating a delicate balance between central oversight and regional autonomy. The persistence of post-Taiping uprisings illustrated that while the rebellion had been militarily crushed, the social grievances it had exploited, poverty, inequality, and discontent with governance, remained deeply rooted, ensuring ongoing instability in the Chinese heartland. The Taiping Rebellion left an enduring imprint on Chinese intellectual and revolutionary thought. Its combination of radical social reform, religious zeal, and mass mobilization provided a framework for conceptualizing large-scale change. Late Qing reformers and early 20th century revolutionaries, such as those involved in the self-strengthening movement or the 1911 revolution, analyzed the Taiping as a lesson in both the potential and limitations of revolutionary ideology. They recognized the power of mass mobilization but sought to replace religious doctrine with secular or nationalist ideas, aiming to achieve unity without the ideological fragmentation that had plagued the Heavenly Kingdom. Moreover, the rebellion influenced debates about gender, social hierarchy, and governance. The temporary elevation of women, communal land reforms, and moral discipline were studied by reform-minded intellectuals as examples of how societal change might be implemented. The failures of the Taiping leadership, particularly internal purges and strategic miscalculations, served as cautionary lessons, highlighting the need for disciplined administration and sustainable governance. In sum, the Taiping Rebellion became a reference point for the evolving discourse on reform, revolution, and modernization in China, shaping strategies and ideologies that would culminate in the eventual overthrow of the Qing dynasty decades later. The Taiping Rebellion devastated agriculture in southern and central China, leaving millions of acres of farmland abandoned or destroyed. Prolonged warfare, scorched earth tactics, and the destruction of irrigation systems led to widespread crop failures, famine, and population displacement. Staple crops such as rice and wheat were particularly affected, undermining the food security of entire provinces like Hunan, Jiangxi, and Anhui. Farmers who survived the fighting often returned to ruined fields, facing the dual challenges of labor shortages and destroyed infrastructure. Livestock, essential for plowing and transport, was decimated, compounding the difficulties in restoring productivity. Recovery was slow and uneven. Local gentry, provincial authorities, and foreign advisors collaborated in some regions to rebuild irrigation networks, redistribute land, and incentivize agricultural production. New farming methods, sometimes incorporating Western techniques introduced through missionary and trade contacts, began to emerge, including improved water management, crop rotation, and selective breeding of livestock. Despite these efforts, the economic base of southern China remained fragile for decades, with the lingering effects of famine, labor displacement, and population decline creating persistent challenges. The rebellion thus reshaped the agricultural landscape, demonstrating both the vulnerability of China's food systems to internal conflict and the resilience of local communities in rebuilding them. The Taiping Rebellion had profound effects on trade, both domestic and international. Rivers, which had been vital arteries for commerce, became contested zones, frequently blocked or militarized during the conflict. The Yangtze River, in particular, saw repeated sieges, blockades, and naval engagements, disrupting the movement of goods and forcing merchants to find alternative routes or suspend operations entirely. Urban centers that had functioned as trading hubs were destroyed or depopulated, undermining local economies and interrupting supply chains for textiles, tea, silk, and other commodities. Markets in rebel-controlled territories often operated under strict Taiping regulations, including the redistribution of goods, rationing, and suppression of private wealth, which further disrupted traditional trade networks. In the post-rebellion period, trade gradually recovered, but with significant structural changes. Qing authorities and regional elites encouraged the reopening of markets, reconstruction of roads and ports, and restoration of commercial networks. Foreign powers, particularly Britain and France, leveraged their control over treaty ports to dominate trade and influence economic recovery. This led to a semi-modernization of commerce, integrating Western accounting methods, technology, and banking practices with traditional Chinese market systems. While trade gradually resumed, the rebellion demonstrated the vulnerability of China's economic infrastructure to internal conflict, highlighting the need for more resilient networks and administrative oversight to ensure long-term stability. The aftermath of the Taiping Rebellion catalyzed significant long-term shifts in regional economies. Provinces that were heavily affected experienced depopulation, labor scarcity, and a decline in agricultural productivity, which slowed economic recovery. Some regions, however, adapted by consolidating landholdings, reorganizing labor, and diversifying economic activities. Artisan and craft production shifted to areas less affected by conflict, while merchant families relocated to safer trading centers, creating new commercial hubs. Urban reconstruction incorporated lessons from the rebellion, including improved infrastructure and fortified trade networks to prevent future disruptions. These transformations also contributed to social stratification and the emergence of new economic elites. Regional gentry who had provided military and logistical support during the rebellion leveraged their influence to consolidate wealth and political power, often becoming dominant figures in local governance and economic activity. The combined effects of population shifts, land redistribution, and trade realignment reshaped regional economies, creating patterns of growth and stagnation that persisted into the late Qing period. In essence, the rebellion not only caused immediate devastation but also acted as a catalyst for profound structural economic changes, demonstrating the deep and lasting interplay between warfare, society, and commerce in 19th century China. One of the most distinctive aspects of the Taiping Rebellion was its religious foundation, which drew inspiration from Christianity while adapting it to local Chinese contexts. Hong Xiuquan, the leader of the Heavenly Kingdom, claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, establishing a syncretic faith that blended Christian theology with Confucian moral codes and Chinese cultural norms. This ideology provided a powerful unifying force for the Taiping army and civilian population, giving purpose to social reforms, military campaigns, and community organization. Followers were motivated not just by political or economic incentives, but by a deeply held belief in divine mission, which fueled extraordinary dedication and discipline. The rebellion's religious dimension also left a lasting imprint on Chinese Christianity. Missionaries in southern China observed the movement with fascination and concern, documenting its structure, teachings, and social impact. Although many missionaries criticized the movement as heretical and violent, they were impressed by its organizational sophistication and ability to mobilize large populations. In the decades following the rebellion, Chinese converts and foreign missionaries reflected on the Taiping experience to inform their approaches to evangelism, religious education, and social work. The syncretic nature of Taiping Christianity demonstrated both the adaptability of foreign religious ideas and the potential for religious ideology to intersect with revolutionary politics in ways that could transform society on a massive scale. The Taiping Rebellion offered profound lessons in the use and limits of ideology as a tool for social transformation. The Heavenly Kingdom combined religious fervor with radical social reforms, including land redistribution, gender equality, moral regulation, and communal living. These measures, while initially successful in creating a cohesive society within controlled territories, revealed the dangers of ideological rigidity. Purges of dissenting leaders, strict enforcement of moral codes, and suppression of independent thought weakened internal cohesion and undermined long-term stability. Chinese reformers and revolutionary thinkers in the late Qing and early Republican periods studied these outcomes carefully. While rejecting the religious framework, they sought to retain the strengths of Taiping ideology: the ability to mobilize mass support, the integration of moral or social principles into governance, and the vision of a more equitable society. Intellectuals such as Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen examined the rebellion's successes and failures, incorporating lessons into secular reformist and revolutionary strategies. In this way, the Taiping Rebellion became a conceptual touchstone, illustrating both the transformative potential of ideology and the practical limits of radical social engineering when combined with military and political challenges. The ideological legacy of the Taiping Rebellion extended well beyond religion, influencing debates on governance, social justice, and national reform. The rebellion demonstrated the potential for revolutionary movements to challenge entrenched dynastic authority, redistribute wealth, and promote gender equality, even in a deeply hierarchical society. These concepts resonated with later reform movements, including the self-strengthening movement, the 100 Days Reform, and early 20th century revolutionary societies. Even after the failure of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, remnants of its ideology persisted in popular culture, local governance experiments, and revolutionary discourse. The idea that radical change could be achieved through collective action, moral rigor, and disciplined organization inspired generations of activists and reformers. While the religious aspects faded, the principles of social equality, ethical governance, and the mobilization of ordinary people remained influential. The rebellion thus occupies a complex place in Chinese history. As a catastrophic conflict, a failed utopian experiment, and a source of enduring ideological inspiration that shaped revolutionary thought well into the modern era. The Taiping Rebellion, which raged from 1850 to 1864, stands as one of the deadliest and most transformative civil conflicts in human history. Beginning as a localized religious uprising in Guangxi province under the leadership of Hong Xiuquan, it rapidly escalated into a massive movement challenging the Qing dynasty across southern and central China. At its height, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled vast territories, including major cities such as Nanjing, which served as the movement's capital. The rebellion was characterized by its unique blend of religious zeal, radical social reform, and revolutionary ambition, seeking to overthrow centuries of dynastic rule and replace traditional Confucian governance with a new moral and social order. The conflict fundamentally altered China's social, political, and economic landscape. Tens of millions perished due to warfare, famine, and disease, with entire regions experiencing depopulation and economic collapse. Traditional social hierarchies and cultural practices were disrupted, particularly through the promotion of gender equality, communal land ownership, and moral regulation. The Qing dynasty, weakened and forced to rely on regional armies and foreign assistance, learned critical lessons in military organization, governance, and infrastructure repair. The rebellion's scale, complexity, and consequences underscore its historical significance as both a tragedy of human suffering and a watershed event that reshaped Chinese society and governance. The Taiping Rebellion offers enduring lessons in governance, military strategy, and the integration of ideology with social reform. The Qing dynasty's initial inability to respond effectively highlighted the risks of rigid, centralized command structures unadapted to large-scale insurgency. The success of regional armies, such as Zhang Guofan's Xiong Army, emphasized the value of disciplined, locally recruited forces capable of coordinated operations while maintaining loyalty to broader imperial objectives. The integration of Western military techniques, logistics, and artillery during the conflict demonstrated the importance of modernization in maintaining state security and responding to internal and external threats. From the perspective of revolutionary movements, the rebellion illustrated the power of ideology in mobilizing large populations, sustaining morale, and justifying radical social change. However, the failures of the Taiping leadership, internal purges, factionalism, and overextension underscored the dangers of excessive rigidity and disorganization. Leaders and thinkers studying the rebellion recognized the necessity of combining ideological vision with practical governance, coherent command structures, and sustainable resource management. These lessons influenced later reformers and revolutionaries, shaping approaches to both internal governance and broader strategies for societal transformation. The historical significance of the Taiping Rebellion extends beyond its immediate destruction. Socially, it demonstrated the potential for radical reform, particularly regarding gender equality, land redistribution, and communal organization, even in a deeply hierarchical and conservative society. Politically, it revealed the vulnerabilities of the Qing dynasty, accelerated military modernization, and highlighted the growing influence of foreign powers in China's internal affairs. Economically, it disrupted trade, devastated agriculture, and prompted regional restructuring, setting the stage for future efforts to integrate Western methods into governance and commerce. Culturally and ideologically, the rebellion's legacy endured in intellectual discourse, revolutionary thought, and popular memory. Its combination of religious fervor, moral discipline, and revolutionary zeal provided a framework for later reform movements, secular revolutionary societies, and debates about social justice and governance. The Taiping Rebellion thus occupies a complex place in Chinese history, as a catastrophe of immense human suffering, as a radical experiment in social and ideological transformation, and as a source of enduring lessons for both statecraft and revolutionary strategy. Its story continues to inform historians, policymakers, and the public, illustrating the possibilities and perils of revolutionary change in human societies. And that brings us to the end of our incredible journey through the Taiping Rebellion. Today, we've seen a world where faith and ideology clashed with empire, where millions perished, and where radical visions for equality and social reform rose and tragically fell. The rebellion teaches us lessons about the power and peril of ambition, the consequences of inequality, and the ways human societies respond to crisis. From the rise of Hong Xiuquan and his revolutionary heavenly kingdom to the devastation left in the aftermath, we've explored the social, political, economic, and cultural impact of this historic conflict. We've learned how revolutions can inspire future generations, even when they fail, and how history's echoes shape the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to uncover more stories that bring the past to life, don't forget to subscribe to History Teller YT, hit that notification bell, and join us again as we explore more epic tales from history. Every story we tell is a journey, and we'd love for you to come along for the next adventure. Until then, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's the story of US, and every chapter teaches something new.